Hello and welcome back to DriveDriverDriven. Today we're going to start on the engine build, but before we do, we got to clean up this mess behind me. And just like that, cleaned up, got all the engine bits on the bench, and we're ready to go. So let me take you through the components for this build. I got a lot of these parts from Fab 9 Tuning, and got to say those guys are great over there. I think they were really quick on the order turnaround, and they were super helpful on piecing together all the parts for the build. Whatever wasn't sourced at Fab 9 Tuning was sourced from Flyin Miata. So like the clutch Happy Meal kit came from Flyin Miata, as well as a few other parts. So let's start at the bottom end. This is a forged crank, even though down here we see the old forged crank. The 2-liter Duratec engine comes with a forged crank from the factory. However, on the crank snout, they are not keyed. This is a keyed crank. Not that I'm doing supercharging or turbocharging or particularly high revving. I do have those options in the future by using a keyed crank. And it does slightly change the way you time the engine, and I'll cover that more when we get to that point. That's going to be outfitted with K1 rods, Wiseco forged lightweight pistons, King bearings, ARP studs up and down. I've also got for the head SuperTech valve spring and retainer, titanium retainer kit, as well as new seals for the head. Fab 9 supplied their cams, which is I went with a stage 2 cam, not the crazy stuff, to have some kind of bottom end power. Over here is the bottom end pan. This is the ATR billet pan with a 10-degree slope on it, and this is for this engine in this car in this application. Radium PCV plate, as well as new larger injectors for the heavier breathing engine, some other bearings, plugs, new keyed crank gear for the timing chain. There's a new timing chain as well, tensioners, all that stuff, gaskets, and so on. This is the oil adapter plate, and this is to run an external oil cooler and an external inline oil filter. And that's about it. On the floor here is our pressure plate and our flywheel. And I think I went with like a stage 1 application, not particularly heavy because the car doesn't need it. It's less than half the weight of a stock Miata. And then our older engine bits, some of which will need to be cleaned up and go back in, like the oil pump, and some of which are going to go away, like the old injectors, the timing sliders, timing chain, etc. And then our block itself cleaned up and ready to go. So the goal for this engine is not absolute crazy horsepower. I say that knowing it's me, and all I can build is monsters. So this is like a baby monster. The goal is around 220 horsepower. I'll be happy with anything between like 215 and 230. I think much more than 230 is going to be a bit of a handful in the car. I'm after both a good, strong power band, as well as something that's comfortable to cruise and not just on and off throttle. So I think with the components I've chosen, we'll end up pretty close to those goals. So for now, let's go ahead and get the block prepped, and we'll do our cylinder honing and get that done and ready for our base measurements. All right, got the block set up here. We're ready to get started, and I kind of wanted to show you a few things about the different hones, the types of hones, why you use them, and what it is that you're looking for when you do use them. So pull this guy out here first. This is just a block hone, nothing really special to it. These shoes are what is going to do your cutting. They're very hard but very brittle. And you may have noticed that I've got this tape set up on here. Well, that is so when we toss this in, that if you can see down in there, the end of the shoe doesn't go past the end of the bore, because if it does, like in this cylinder, it'll just collide with the webbing down there, and it'll just shatter these shoes. So you put on a piece of tape to remind you not to go past that point, otherwise you'll damage the tool. This is a ball hone. Well, I'll pull that out later. You use this block hone first with these shoes, and that does your initial cutting, and it leaves these kind of hard-pointed edges when it's done. I'm going to go through the actual actions and have you guys watch, but it'll leave a sharp crosshatch, and that's that crosshatch shape that everyone looks for, and it'll be all the way up and down the bore. After you've done that, though, you need to use a ball hone, or dingleberry hone, whatever you want to call it, to sort of knock down the sharp edges and pull some debris out of the cylinder from this honing process. And what that does is it sets up the cylinders for a better seal with the rings. And you don't need to go like crazy. You don't need to go hog wild with the thing. Just number of strokes up and down with the drill at kind of like max speed is all you need to do. You don't need to go super crazy with it. And you can sort of see in the cylinders here how it's really shiny up in here in top. And then down below, it's kind of hard to see in there, but down below, it's less shiny. There's a ring, and it's a little bit darker. Well, that's where the piston rings stop, and then they come back up in the bore. So you can sort of see what's left of the factory hone finish. And what you don't want is, you don't want this mirror shine. Basically, these have been smoothed down, and they're not going to seal as well as they once did. And the oil isn't going to stick to the cylinder walls as good, which won't seal the rings as well, and so on and so forth. So when you use this hone first, it's going to have a sharp, kind of shiny crosshatch pattern. And then when you finish off with the ball hone, it's going to have kind of a matte finish. And what I want to try and do here is we'll use just this hone on one cylinder, this hone and this one on the next, and then leave one completely stock so you can see the differences side by side from start to finish. I sort of screwed up the order, but this is where we're at. So this cylinder was untouched, and you can see it's still got the line down in there. It's kind of a mirror type of finish. So this is the original 74,000 mile abuse cylinder. This cylinder had the block hone and the ball hone. So you can sort of see how it has a matte finish. You can sort of see the crosshatch in there. Let me grab a... There we go, flashlight. So that shows up a little bit better. So you can see the difference between the original cylinder and one that's good to go. So this is the important difference. So this is just the block hone. Oh, come on, light. So that's just the block hone. And if you compare it to this guy, see how this one has more of a shine to it. It's a bit shinier. If you sort of look at it this angle, that the high spot from the light sort of reminds you of like grooves in a record. That's because those points are sharp and they grab the light more, versus over here it's dull because those edges have been softened a bit, and we've knocked those edges down with the ball hone, and that's that matte finish that I was telling you about. So again, our block hone here, and then moving over to this guy, we hit this with the ball hone. You can still see some high spots, so I'm going to go back over it with the ball hone, but that's a good example of what it looks like with this is a good example of what it looks like with the block hone, what it looks like when you're done with a complete cylinder with the ball hone. This is what it looks like when you're not quite done. You can still see some high spots, and you need to go a little bit longer with that ball hone. And then again, back to the original, you can see there's definitely a big difference. So I'm going to finish this up. We'll knock this out. And then the next step is we're going to do some base measurements with the cylinders to now get our final cylinder measurement, and then our bottom end bearing measurements. I'll pick up the camera again when I'm ready to do that. All right, I just wanted to put a quick update on honing on the engine. I know in the video it kind of looks like I went full send, and I sort of did, but I had to come back and correct it. So that's kind of hot there, but I had to go back and redo all of the honing because the cylinders were, let's see if that shows up a little bit better, but the cross hatching was too flat, and it really needs to be at like a 45-degree angle. So basically what that meant was too much rotational speed and not enough up and down speed. So I had to go back over these and carefully slow down the drill while I sped up the kind of up and down motion as I went through it. So just a fair warning, like be careful when you're doing this. I know I got all excited and went all crazy, but really what you need to do is when you're doing the honing, you need to go up and down in the cylinder bore with a slower speed, because the idea is you want the balls or the hone blocks to come up and down in like a 45-degree angle, and that's what creates that crosshatch pattern, versus one that's totally sideways like this. And if that happens, you'll create hot spots, and you won't have really good lubricity on your rings and oil retention on the cylinder walls. So just a note, I wanted to mention that before moving on. All right, fast forward a little bit, and we've got the cylinders done, and we're moving on to the bottom end. So I've replaced the main studs with ARP bottom end studs. I don't know, I've just been a fan of ARP. Not that this motor is going to be apart a lot, but I like the additional strength it provides. And again, I did mention that the crank is keyed, so there is a possibility down the road of adding a turbo or a supercharger, but again, that's not what I'm doing right now for the build as it sits. But even if you're not adding those things, this will help make the bottom end more robust for turning higher RPMs. The bearings, these are King bearings. I haven't used these before, but so far I like what I see with the nicer nicer openings for the oil galley, allowing some more oil down in and through the bearings themselves. They're a coated bearing, so that should help them persevere in low oil pressure environments, such as like initial startup, or if there's a low oil pressure event on track, that'll help the bearing survive a little bit longer. And here in our main stud girdle, again, got all the King bearings in. I've labeled each of the journals so I can keep everything straight. And what I'm going to do now is put the girdle onto the main studs and torque everything down. And then the goal is to actually measure what the inner diameter is of the bearings with everything torqued, to make sure that I have the right amount of clearance between these bearings and the crank. All right, so here we are checking the bore. All of the stud girdle nuts, all the main bolts have been tightened. They're torqued to spec. You do it in 3 steps, first to 20 foot-pounds, then 40 foot-pounds, and then 60 foot-pounds. Down here, this is a bore gauge, and what I'm doing is I'm checking the diameter, the inner diameter of this, basically the crank opening with the bearing installed, to see how wide it is. And I've zeroed out this tool to 2 inches, and then it's showing me that this opening is 2 inches and 48 thousandths. So if I move this in, we'll do the next one, and you can see the gauge there. So it's moving around. Oop, I just fell out. So on this one, you can see we're at like right about the same. Don't know how well that's showing up on camera, but you can see in the gauge here that we're measuring just like literally a hair under the same 2 inches and 48 thousandths. And I've done all of the other bores. I've done these mains. I've done the crank. So this is the first tool. It's like a bore gauge, a bore dial indicator. And down in this end, this is what actually will take the measurement. I've also had to use this tool for the stuff that's a little harder to reach. So all the way back down in here, like I can't get to number 5. Let's see if I can do this while holding the camera. And my hand's in the way, but you can sort of see that I'm holding it in place. There we go, if we kind of look on that side. And it's a nice tight fit. It doesn't really move. There's no rattle or anything like that. And so you would tighten this once you have it in place. Again, it's easier to with 2 hands. But you tighten this, you'll pull it out, and then you'll measure it with a dial indicator, and that'll give you your final measurement. Not the most perfect way to do it, but it'll work in a pinch. And so these are the measurements I've found. So mains for block is, this is the bores for all the mains. Crank is the actual mains on the crank themselves. And then this is our rod measurements. I haven't opened the rods yet, but I did measure the crank while I was at it. And that came in at 1.846 inches all across. To measure the crank, again, just use dial caliper right on the end. And you want to get the tightest measurement, and lather, rinse, and repeat for all of the bores, like all the mains, all of the rod ends for each. And then we've written them down, so now we know that on our mains, our block opening is 2 inches and 48 thousandths, but our crank diameter is only 2 inches and 44 thousandths. So we have 4 thousandths clearance there. And that's pretty much the same all the way across. There's a couple that are 1,000th of an inch tighter, so it's 0.3 or whatever, 0.003. But I know that everything will work out with the bearings that we've selected, with the crank that we have. So now that that's done, we can now measure our rod big ends with everything torqued down and make sure those are up to snuff.